Hey folks, Palmer Toms of DawgsHQ here with Wes Mitchell from Gamecock Central. Wes, appreciate you coming on this week, and we're previewing the SEC opener for both of our teams that we're covering. Georgia, South Carolina, 3:30 CBS from Athens. Wes, first off, just again, thanks for coming on. And what's the expectation like this week in Columbia headed into the first conference game of the year?
Yeah, I think the fans, obviously, they get excited for this game every single year. It's kind of, at least on the South Carolina end, it's always kind of been a game that fans get up for. And traditionally, over the years, until this most recent run for Georgia, this is a game I feel like South Carolina every single year kind of goes into it as an underdog, and most years has found a way to keep it close again until like these last 3 years or so. And so, I think the fan base is excited. I think they know what South Carolina is up against. Like, if you go on our message board right now, it's not a lot of people who are sitting there saying, oh, yeah, South Carolina is definitely going to pull the upset. They know what a tall task it is. They know how good Georgia has been the last couple of years. But still, obviously, SEC opener, a great facility there in Georgia. Like, it's always fun, I think, to watch your team go play in these big games and big environments and all those things. So the fans have recovered a little bit from the loss to North Carolina, and they're looking ahead to just see if South Carolina can compete and give themselves a chance to maybe pull the stunner in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it here early in this season. It's typically this matchup of some border rivals is an early one. Kirby said it earlier this week that it feels like Georgia, either opens with South Carolina in the in the conference schedule, or it's near that front end of the schedule pretty much every year. Last year, I know it was Georgia's opener, and I know South Carolina played Arkansas in week 2. But that road trip to South Carolina and Columbia there was Georgia's SEC opener. I think it was the SEC opener for Georgia in 2021. So each of these last 2 seasons, it's come as that week 3 matchup. And hey, we're not going to get this game next year, which is going to be weird. Looking ahead at that 2024 schedule, these two teams have played 75 times going into Saturday. First game came back in the 1890s, and all of a sudden this is going from an annual showdown of Georgia and South Carolina to something that we may not see, but every other year.
Yeah, it's kind of sad, honestly, man. I mean, if you grow up in either state, you're used to these two teams playing each other every single year, honestly. And there's been some special games, special moments on both sides that I think probably are good memories for Georgia fans and South Carolina fans, depending on which side of this thing you're on. And, when that schedule came out, it was, for South Carolina. So I think I'm getting this right. They don't have next year Georgia, Tennessee, or Florida, which is, that those are teams you're definitely used to playing.
Your marquee East opponents.
Exactly. And, South Carolina and Georgia, as you said, even before, South Carolina was in the SEC in 1992, these schools have played each other, for the last century plus. So, Carolina hosted Furman last week, an in-state school. They've played Georgia far more times than they've played like the Furmans or Woffords or schools that they actually, in the early to mid 1900s, South Carolina played Furman all the time, played Wofford a ton, I think. But I mean, I don't have the numbers in front of me. South Carolina has probably played Georgia more than about any other school out there, other than, the obvious would be Clemson. But Georgia's got to be up there as far as just the number of times they've matched up.
Yeah, and I think what makes it interesting talking about that, future of this rivalry in this series is that Georgia has so many teams that it considers to be a rival. And, that was the tricky part with the SEC scheduling, that, Georgia fans felt like they had to play Florida, they had to play Auburn, and having those 2 games out there, where do you throw in a third game? Is it South Carolina? Is it Kentucky, who I think Georgia is going to end up being? I think is going to end up being that third team for Georgia. Tennessee is another team that Georgia has a lot of classic games with over the last couple of years and over the history of those 2 programs. So they've got all those teams on the schedule for 2024, but it'll be really interesting. Once we learn what the 25 what the format is going forward and what that 25 schedule looks like. I would assume that Georgia and South Carolina would be on there. Considering that they're not in 24, but let's enjoy it while we got it.
Yeah, for sure. And Palmer, I think it'll be interesting to see, depending on how often they play each other, does that lessen kind of the little bit of hatred between the two fan bases, or does it strengthen it in that when you do play them, you're a little bit more, it means a little bit more. And again, I do think, to be completely fair, completely frank, like I think South Carolina fans probably, as far as SEC teams go, they see Georgia as being like, for one, that's what you're aiming for. But for two, South Carolina fans have always seen that as a rivalry and an opportunity to kind of knock Georgia off their perch. Whereas, for Georgia, you have some more traditional in-conference rivals for them. So it's kind of interesting there. Gamecock fans definitely, I feel like, dislike Georgia like a true rival, just not quite on the level that they do dislike Clemson.
Right. I guess as we move into talking about this Saturday's game, the quarterbacks is kind of where I want to start this conversation. And I think, I know it's the case for Georgia coming into this year, and it has been the first 2 weeks. And certainly looking at the stat sheet and the way that South Carolina has filled it up and Spencer Rattler has filled it up, that's a position of, talking points for the Gamecocks. What do you make of this quarterback battle between Carson Beck, first season as a starter? This will be his first SEC start versus Spencer Rattler, somebody that's, obviously got experience as a starter and has had one heck of a start to the season.
Yeah, man, and I'll try to keep it on the quarterbacks, but obviously the other layer to that is, if you're South Carolina, can you protect Spencer Rattler? And I think that ultimately is the key for them in this game based on what we've seen so far. But in terms of just the quarterbacks themselves, I mean, you look at Rattler, we had heard all offseason, like, hey, this guy has taken it to a completely different level than it was this time last year. This time last year, it was more about, hey, man, this guy can spin it. The talent is like apparent right off the bat. You can see why he was the number one quarterback recruited in the 2019 class. All kind of the natural things, like the natural ability there. This year, it's been more about, hey, he's an even better leader now. He's not missing throws. His accuracy is off the charts. He's got a great understanding of where the ball is supposed to go. Those things that I think make the difference between being a quarterback with upside and being, a great quarterback on the field. So far, he has actually translated what we heard was happening in practice into the game. So, I think Rattler's been great. He's been comfortable. Even you look at North Carolina, they got sacked 9 times, man, which is, an insane stat. He still put up his numbers. He still found a way to get the ball down the field. I thought he was a warrior in that game. And really, you're seeing Rattler become who people thought he was going to be out of high school. So if you're going to say there's one thing that can give South Carolina a chance, I think going into most games they go into this year, it's number 7. It's Spencer Rattler. We saw that against Tennessee last year. He went supernova on their defense and, really led South Carolina to a win. I think a lot of us are sitting here not really knowing a whole lot about Carson Beck. Like, you're sitting there saying, all right, highly recruited. Everybody at Georgia's highly recruited. Won the job. That obviously means something. But have we seen him be in a situation where he has to go win a game yet? Can South Carolina put him in a situation to have to go win the game or not? I think if this game was in Columbia, that would be a little bit more of a storyline. Hey, he's got to go on the road. He's got to face this hostile environment, all those things. Obviously, this one's in Athens. He's probably going to be pretty comfortable in front of the home crowd. So I think that's the big thing. If you're South Carolina, can you make the quarterback conversation be a storyline, or do the trenches keep it from really being a storyline for either team?
No, I mean, I completely agree with you there. And y'all are not alone in not really knowing much about Carson Beck in terms of, what he brings to the table, because Georgia fans and Georgia media and, to a certain extent, I would imagine Georgia coaches don't know that, because they don't know how he's going to respond when a game is tight. He played, I think it was 7 games last year, got in against South Carolina, looked good against the Gamecocks there in Columbia, but the band was playing. I mean, that was the largest margin of victory in series history. So, he hasn't really had to face that pressure. He didn't really have to face it against UT Martin or Ball State. To me, I think going back and assessing those 2 games, it's the slow starts offensively. They only put up 7 points in the first quarter against UT Martin. They were scoreless at the end of 1 against Ball State. And then they exploded in the second quarter against Ball State, 31 points. Now, a lot of that, like you said, trying to keep this to the quarterbacks, but a lot of that for Georgia had to do with the fact that the defense got turnovers and put them in great plus position. And they were able to turn that into points. But, I do think that there's a chance that this is the biggest test that he will have faced yet. You're absolutely right. If this game was in Columbia, I mean, the reason that we're all circling Auburn for Georgia is because that is the first road game of the year, and that's the first time that he's going to have to go into a hostile environment. Williams-Brice Stadium would certainly be that if this game were there. It's not. It's in Sanford Stadium. It's in Athens, and I think that you're right there. A lot of it comes down to with those 2 quarterbacks. It's funny to do a quarterback comparison because the quarterback on quarterback battle, those 2 are never going to be on the field at the same time. They're not going head to head. It's the weapons that are around them, and it's the opposition that they're going to end up facing, the secondary, the pressure, all that. That's really the battle. It's not Carson Beck versus Spencer Rattler. It's Carson Beck versus that South Carolina secondary, that South Carolina front, and vice versa with Georgia and Spencer Rattler. And as we talk about the things that Spencer Rattler is going to have to face, I think, it is worth mentioning Georgia could be down a very key starter in its secondary in Javon Bullard, who suffered a sprained ankle this past Saturday against Ball State. Left the game in the first quarter, came back to the sideline in street clothes with a boot on his left foot. Kirby said on Monday that they really wouldn't know until Wednesday what his availability would be like. He did not practice on Monday. I think he went through and did some stuff on Tuesday. And I will say, I did watch him, as they were, he was talking to trainers. They were discussing whether he was going to go back in. He was working on backpedaling. It wasn't like he couldn't walk on it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that to me says this is probably not that, dreaded high ankle sprain. It's probably a more minor issue than that. And so could he end up playing? Absolutely. Do I think he does? I would probably say his status is probably more towards him being sidelined than it is him being a star. And so you look at that Georgia defense as a little bit maybe vulnerable there because they're missing a vocal leader, a proven player, and a physical presence there.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point because if I had to point out a strength of this South Carolina team so far, other than Spencer Rattler, you probably go out to those wide receivers. And, I know you guys covering Georgia, us covering South Carolina. Every year you kind of think you have an idea of who the standouts are going to be, kind of how things are going to play out based on what's being said publicly, what you're hearing behind the scenes. And then sometimes it's like, all right, this guy didn't quite play as well as my expectations were. And then other times it's, wow, that guy's taking an even bigger jump, bigger leap than I thought.
And this is Antoine Wells, Xavier Leggett.
Yes. And so Xavier has he was that guy who we've all seen it, comes in early and shows flashes, and you're kind of just waiting on the breakout to happen. And for a good portion of the career, was banged up at times. Just there was always something holding him back, was having to rotate, didn't get a ton of opportunities last year, impacted the kickoff return game. But this year, especially, so Juice Wells, he's the guy that's been coming off an injury this time. Leggett has just completely taken over the first 2 games at receiver, and he was a guy we always knew that ability was there. But the confidence has kind of been the difference maker now. Like, that's going through the roof for him. Amarian Brown, who's another injury situation to keep an eye on. He is questionable for this week. He kind of has emerged as that slot kind of third receiver, you would say. But I think as he gets healthy, you look at this receiving core, it's going to be one of the better ones that South Carolina has had in terms of just having guys who can make plays at all three spots. Like most teams, they use different personnel packages, but a lot of times it's going to be three receivers, one tight end, and one running back. Sometimes they'll go two tight ends, but for the most part, it's kind of your typical base college offense right now from a personnel standpoint. So Eddie Lewis emerged this past week. He's a transfer guy from Memphis. He was Memphis's top receiver, transferred into South Carolina this offseason. If AB, Amarian Brown, can't go, then Eddie Lewis probably slots right in there and replacing him. So for South Carolina, because of the running game issues, because of the O-line issues, we've seen them start to kind of just extend it out, lots of quick passes. You'll see them line Leggett up actually in the backfield at times as well, but then motion him out and try to get him the ball on the perimeter. So I think not just the Georgia secondary in terms of covering people if they do have, injury situations there, but tackling on the perimeter, getting off blocks on the perimeter, because Carolina just has not showed so far that they can consistently run the ball in the middle of the field. That means quick throws to the outside. That's kind of, I think, going to be some of the identity of this South Carolina offense early on. Frankly, because they don't really have a choice. That's kind of what they've had to do so far.
Yeah, and I think as you talk about Georgia, in their offensive approach, it's kind of the same thing because the Bulldogs have not been great at running the ball. I would say they've probably fared a little bit better than South Carolina in the pass protection aspect of it, giving up, I believe it was one sack this past Saturday, none in the first game. But the offensive line in that run game and the push they're getting up front, it has not been there to the level that you would like to see it if you're a Georgia fan. And so because of that, they've been forced to get the ball out in space, tunnel screens and such. When you've got players like Dominic Lovett transferred in from Missouri, was their leading receiver last year. He's a speedy guy. You've got Arian Smith out there. You've got, a walk-on who's, showed out to be an impressive player so far this season, special teams asset. Mekhi Muse, he's been, very valuable to this Georgia offense and their ability to push the ball downfield, using that extension of the run game is what Kirby calls it. So, interested to see that. Interested to see, how does South Carolina approach that? I mean, obviously losing, Mo Kaba for the season, that hurts that front seven. But when you've got a Tonka Hemingway in there, a defensive lineman, strong guy up there, are you gonna, and you've got a, first time starter, at quarterback, are you going to put those receivers out on an island a little bit more and those DBs on an island and say, hey, you guys have got to win your matchups because we're going to load the box and force them to, we're going to take away that run and we're going to force this young not really young, but inexperienced quarterback to make plays. It's going to be interesting to see how they approach that to me because that's what UT Martin did. That's what Ball State did. They loaded that box and they said, hey, if you beat us on the outside, beat us downfield. And Georgia did that at times. I mean, like I said, they did open things up a little bit more last week, and I fully expect them to open things up more this week. But very interested to see kind of how Georgia approaches South Carolina's offense and that passing attack. Maybe you put a little bit more, it could be the inverse there. You give Georgia and that secondary, a group that's got a first-year starter at corner, a first-time starter at safety in all likelihood with Bullard out. Do you give them a little bit more help and let South Carolina try to beat you with an offensive line and run game that hasn't gotten it done versus, if you're South Carolina, do you, force Georgia to try to get the ball to the outside and beat you that way?
Yeah, I think if Georgia decides not to put that extra guy in the box and leave, kind of the extra guy in coverage, and then South Carolina still can't run the football, I think that's kind of your recipe for disaster for South Carolina because it's one thing to have that extra hat up there and you're seeing, single high defenses and you're like, oh, we can't run it. Let's just keep throwing it. It's another if they're, two safeties back and you still can't run the football. So, for them on the other side, for South Carolina, just their own defensive identity, they typically are an extra man in the box defense. Like they play a lot of single high. You will see them roll their safeties down into the box. That's something we actually anticipated them doing quite a bit of that with Nick Emmanwori, who is, arguably, their best defender, definitely one of their best defenders. He's been banged up. He is kind of day to day for this. He's technically questionable. Same deal. I'm sure y'all deal with this stuff too. He practiced on Tuesday, but it's not that he's out there full go. It's kind
Yep.
of, what does he practice mean? And how does he respond to that? So I think, and anytime, as you know, man, hamstrings, you just never know. You never know
Well,
what
and
that's
and and Georgia's dealing with that, kind of same situation right now with a receiver in Lad McConkey, who's been battling a back issue, and like you said, hamstrings, those soft tissue things. I would throw a back in there. Those things are very sensitive, and so when you've got guys that are out there practicing, maybe they're not taking contact, but they're going through individual drills with their position groups and working off to the side with trainers. It's all about how do they feel, Friday night, Saturday morning, waking up for this game, because a hamstring, a back, whatever could feel great one day and pretty bad the next day, and vice versa. So that's kind of where I'm at with Georgia's injury situation in terms of Bullard trying to come back from that ankle, McConkey trying to come back from battling a back injury, Daijun Edwards, and I do think that this will help Georgia's run game a little bit. Daijun Edwards, leading returning rusher, coming back off of an MCL sprain. He did not play in the first 2 games. It sounds like he's getting closer and closer to being there, and I kind of expect him to play this weekend. So that's where Georgia's at from an injury standpoint. And you mentioned a couple of the big ones with South Carolina. So.
Yeah, and I think, man, it's this thing where all these guys are competitors too, so they want to be out there, they want to play, and you're kind of trying to walk that line. I think if you're the staff, if you're the medical staff, for both these teams, hamstring can feel great when you wake up in the morning, and then you take one kind of extra stretch out there, and now, hey, you're out another 3 to 4 weeks. So I think they got to be careful with these guys, but obviously they all want to play. And I do think it's interesting. I don't know if y'all's fans are here like ours are, but our fans here at Gamecock Central, every single – oh, man, another guy's hurt. How does this happen to us? Why is another guy banged up? And it's like, guys, it's football. Like, every team in the country is dealing with – like, you can just fill in the blanks. Georgia's guys are dealing with a lot of the same stuff this time of year that South Carolina's guys are. Juice Wells, actually, he's played the first 2 games, but he was coming off of an offseason injury. So it's kind of been a slow buildup for him where he's cleared. He's healthy, but he's just kind of getting back to where you would say he is. He hasn't quite been where he was. Part of it just from missing so much practice where he was last year, obviously, where he was South Carolina's leading receiver. So, I think all teams go through these things, and both sides are going to be managing them as well as they possibly can. And some of these guys we're talking about will probably play and end up being just fine. And some of them, may wake up Saturday and try to run around, and they're told, no, like I know you want to play, but you gotta live to fight another day. We can't have you go out there and hurt yourself even more. So I do think, though, for both sides, it sounds like that will be an important storyline. Like I said, Wells is fine. Like, he's going to play. But Emmanwori, that's a key guy for South Carolina. He emerged for them last year. I remember him making tackle after tackle against Georgia as kind of that last line of defense last year, where Georgia was breaking past the second level, explosive runs, and Emmanwori was at least there to clean it up and keep it from being, an even longer run. So I think you also start to, if you really want to get into the weeds, who for South Carolina is going to try to cover Brock Bowers. And they play a ton of man coverage, South Carolina does. They mix it up like everybody does, but they like to play man coverage. And I think for them, Emmanwori is probably – healthy Emmanwori is probably the closest thing they have to being a guy with height, length, and speed that you would say maybe that's your best chance to give him some trouble. But, even – Clayton White, South Carolina's defense coordinator, was talking today. He's like, man, I love to hat tip to an opponent going into a game. He's like, Brock Bowers has improved even since we saw him last year, watching him on film, talking about some of the things along the line of scrimmage, just being a more physical, better blocker, I believe is what he was alluding to. But lots of respect from the South Carolina side, obviously, for what Bowers does for Georgia.
And that was one heck of a game that he had last year in Columbia with, big touchdown catch, went over the top. I want to say he even had a run in there as well.
Yeah, I think he did.
Wes, we'll get out of here on this note. For South Carolina, one player that you've got in mind that has to have a great game, that's going to be a difference maker. Who is that one player, and what is that thing that they're going to do that you think could be a difference between South Carolina, being in this game late and making it competitive, and maybe this one turning into like it did last year?
I know it's going to force me to repeat myself on some of these points, man, but it frankly just has to be Spencer Rattler. Like if they're going to win this game, Rattler has to keep doing what he's been doing so far this year. That's making plays even when he's going to get hit, making plays even when there's a guy around him. Again, North Carolina, he got sacked 9 times, but still somehow managed to get the ball down the field, get the ball out, and put them in a situation where they at least were in striking distance with 2 late, red zone opportunities, and they end up losing by 2 scores. So for them, it's Rattler. Everybody else obviously will factor in offensive line play, receivers, all that. But for Carolina to have chances to pull upsets, it has got to be number 7. So what about you, man?
Yeah, and for me, quarterback is obviously one that you could go with, but because of that Spencer Rattler factor, and because of the question that is South Carolina's offensive line and their ability to get a push in the run game and protect in the pass game, I'm looking at Mykel Williams, number 13, there on the edge for Georgia. Had a sack in the opener. We spoke to him after the fact, and he said his goal is a sack a game, and did not get that in this last one. Could have some opportunities to get there. And I think that, for Georgia, because of the questions that we had that we discussed in the secondary, I think that the best way to help your secondary out is by getting home to the quarterback quickly. And so that pressure putting that pressure on those interior defensive linemen, Nazir Stackhouse, Zion Logue, Warren Brinson. Warren looked really good last week, quick off the ball. And so he's somebody else I would circle, but also, that edge pressure. And if you're asking Georgia to come up with one guy that is going to go after the passer, it's Mykel Williams. He's former 5-star for a reason, top defensive lineman in the country for that class. Georgia needs him to be really good, not only in this game, but all season long. And so, he's the one guy I would circle, and his ability or inability to get home to the quarterback, really of this entire defensive front, because it is such a group effort. But if there's one guy, like I said, it would be Mykel Williams.
Well, and to add a little context to that too, man, South Carolina, their projected starter at left tackle, injured in the spring game. So obviously that's something they knew they were going to be dealing with, but they really it's been a work in progress for them to replace Jalen Nichols really all offseason. And then their starting right tackle, played 4 plays against North Carolina. He goes down with a knee injury, got rolled up, is out for at least a while. So if you want to talk about matchups, really it's been South Carolina's offensive tackles. Like interior wise, they haven't been great, but they've been fine. It's really been the offensive tackle spots. So I think that's a great pick. Also, just adding the context of the matchup there, South Carolina has got to solve their offensive tackle issues, and they're introducing a true freshman in Tree Babalade. They played him some last week, but the big question around here has been, do you kind of throw him into the fire in Athens, or is it more of a slow burn? Very talented kid, highly recruited, big future, but just how quickly is it fair to introduce him, to SEC ball? So I think that'll be something to keep an eye on, both from the Georgia standpoint with their pass rushers and the South Carolina standpoint with their offensive tackles, man.
Well, looking forward to this one on Saturday. Like we said, 3:30 CBS. SEC game of the week, an exciting time of year to get this final season of that CBS, the theme music that we've all become so fond of over the years. An exciting season, an exciting time, expecting a great atmosphere here in Athens. And Wes, looking forward to welcoming y'all and seeing y'all this weekend. So, DawgsHQ for your Georgia coverage, Gamecock Central for your South Carolina coverage as Georgia and South Carolina clash to open the conference schedule. Thanks, Wes.
Thank you.